The wind on the prairie wasn't like other winds. It didn't just blow. It sang a long, lonely song as it rushed through the tall, golden grass. On a small piece of land claimed by a hopeful family just a year before, the wind found a little girl named Alara. She was 5, and her world was 2 people. Her papa, with his big, rough hands, and her mama, whose smile was like the sun coming out. Their home was a simple cabin of logs and mud, warm and safe. But lately, a shadow had fallen over it. The shadow was inside Mama. It was a sickness that made her cough, a deep, tired sound that seemed to shake her whole thin frame. She spent her days in bed now, and Alara's job was to be quiet and helpful. She would bring cups of water and sit for hours, holding her mother's hand, telling her stories about her doll, Anya, or about the clouds she saw, shaped like rabbits in ships. Papa's face had grown tight with worry. The medicine from the jar was gone. One evening, he knelt by the bed, his voice a low rumble. "The fever's getting worse. Old man Haskell says there's a doctor in Iron Creek, 2 days' ride. He might have new medicine. Stronger medicine." Mama's eyes, bright with fever, found his. She was too weak to argue, but her hand squeezed his. "Be swift," she whispered, the words ending in a cough. The next morning, Papa packed his horse quickly. He hugged Alara so tightly she could smell the leather and dust on his coat. "You be Mama's big brave girl, my little star," he said, his voice thick. "Look after her. I'll be back before you can miss me." He kissed Mama's forehead, a long silent kiss, and then he was gone. A figure growing smaller and smaller until the prairie swallowed him up. For 2 days, Alara tried to be brave. She tried to make broth from the last bits of salted meat. She would crawl into the big bed and lie next to her mother, listening to the difficult, raspy breaths. Mama slept more and more. But when she was awake, her eyes would find the small window that looked east, toward a gentle hill behind the cabin. Wildflowers grew there in the spring. "See the hill, my heart?" she said to Alara one afternoon, her voice like dry leaves. "Where the flowers are? That's a special place. A good place. If you ever feel lost, you look there. I will always be with you there, remember." Alara didn't understand, but she nodded, pressing her head against her mother's shoulder. "I'll remember, Mama." On the 3rd morning after Papa left, the cabin was too quiet. The usual sound of Mama's breathing had stopped. The fever had broken in the worst way. Alara shook her mother's arm. "Mama, the sun is up." There was no answer. She climbed up and patted her mother's cheek. It was cold. A deep, quiet fear, a kind a child shouldn't know, started in Alara's chest. She didn't cry out. She just sat on the floor beside the bed, holding Anya, waiting for something to change. It was old man Haskell from the claim 3 miles over who found them later that day. He'd come to check, a feeling in his old bones. He took his hat off when he saw, and his old eyes filled with water. He tried to explain to Alara, but the words, gone, passed on. With God or just strange, heavy sounds. She understood only that Mama had to go to the hill. The special hill. The old man worked through the afternoon, digging into the tough prairie earth on the hillside. It was hard work for his old back. Alara watched, silent. He wrapped Mama carefully in a blanket and carried her up. He said some words to the sky, put his hat back on, and then looked down at Alara, standing so small by the pile of fresh, dark earth. "I'm sorry, child," he said, his voice rough. "I gotta get back to my own, my cows. The wife ain't well either. Your pa'll be back soon. You stay right here by the house, you hear?" He seemed torn, but the prairie made people hard choices. He gave her a piece of hard biscuit from his pocket and walked away, leaving her utterly alone for the first time in her life. Elara didn't go back to the empty, silent cabin. The cabin was just a house now. Her mother was here, on this hill. So she sat down on the soft dirt. As the sun began to set, painting the sky in colors of fire and peach, a simple, powerful idea settled in her young mind. Mama was sleeping, and when she, Elara, had bad dreams, she always slept beside Mama in the big bed. That made the dreams go away. So as the first stars appeared, sharp and cold in the vast sky, Elara walked back to the cabin. She took her favorite quilt from her bed, the one Mama had stitched with little stars, and she fetched her doll, Anya. She walked back up the hill in the deepening dark, the prairie wind humming its lonely tune around her. She spread the quilt on the earth beside the mound, curled up with her doll, and closed her eyes. She could almost pretend the sound of the wind in the grass was her mother singing her to sleep. She was keeping watch. She was being a brave girl. And when Mama woke up, she would be right here. The first night was long and very dark. Elara had never been outside alone at night before. The sounds were different. The wind moved through the grass with a sighing sound, and sometimes there would be a rustle that made her hold her doll tighter. But the earth of the mound was soft, and she felt close to her mother. She talked to her in a whisper, the way they used to talk in bed. Anya was good today, Mama. She didn't cry. I told her the story about the rabbit, the one you tell. She waited, listening. She thought maybe she'd hear her mother's voice on the wind. But there was only the sighing and the vast, starry sky looking down. The cold from the ground began to seep through the quilt. Elara curled into a smaller ball, tucking her knees under her chin for warmth. Sleep came in little fits, mixed with moments of waking, confused, and wondering where she was. Each time she opened her eyes and saw the dark shape of the mound, she remembered, and a quiet loneliness, deeper than any fear, settled over her. But it also made her stay. Leaving would be like leaving her mother alone in the dark, and she could never do that. Dawn came slowly, washing the prairie in pale gray light. Elara was stiff and thirsty. She sat up, her small dress wrinkled and damp with dew. She looked at the mound, waiting. Maybe now, in the daytime, her mother would be done sleeping. "Good morning, Mama," she said, her voice small in the huge, empty morning. There was no answer. A bird chirped somewhere far away. A new feeling, a hollow one, started in her stomach. It was hunger. She knew she needed to eat. She was a big girl. She could get food. Carefully, she folded her quilt and laid it neatly on the mound, a marker so her mother would know she was coming back. She walked down the hill to the silent cabin. The door creaked on its hinges. Inside, the quiet was worse. It was a listening quiet. The bed was empty. The fireplace was cold. She found the bread box. There was a heel of yesterday's bread, hard as a rock. She took it and went to the rain barrel at the corner of the house, scooping up handfuls of cold water to drink. It tasted like wood and sky. She sat on the step, gnawing on the hard bread, her eyes always going back to the hill. She couldn't see the quilt from here, just the shape of the land against the sky. She finished the bread, the hollow feeling only partly gone. She had to go back. That was where she was supposed to be. The second day passed in a slow, quiet blur. She spent most of it sitting on the quilt, sometimes talking, sometimes just sitting. She told her mother about the cloud that looked like a horse, and about how Old Man Haskell's dog had chased a rabbit once. She played a little game with Anya in the grass beside the mound. But as the sun climbed high, a new tiredness came over her, different from the tiredness of sleep. It was a heavy feeling in her arms and legs. The loneliness grew bigger, too. It wasn't scary anymore, just big and empty, like the prairie itself. When the sun started to go down again, bringing back the chill. The fear of the long night crept in. She needed her quilt to be warmer. She looked at the mound, an idea forming. She dragged the quilt over to the side that was out of the wind. She patted the earth, smoothing little lumps of dirt. Then she lay down, pressing her back right against the side of the mound. It felt strange, but also solid. It was like she was leaning against the side of the big bed. She pulled the quilt over her, covering herself and Anya completely, making a little tent against the world. The second night was colder. The wind bit through the quilt. Elara shivered, pressing her small back harder into the earth. She cried then, quiet tears that made hot tracks down her cold cheeks. She wasn't crying from fear of the dark noises. She was crying because she was starting to understand that her mother's sleep was a different kind. A kind that didn't end with the sunrise. The hope that had kept her warm was fading, like the last light in the sky, and the cold was taking its place. She must have slept, because she dreamed. She dreamed of her mother's voice, clear as day, saying, "Look to the hill." But in the dream, the hill was empty, and she was all alone, spinning around and around trying to find where the voice came from. She woke up with a start. It was the deep, black middle of the night. For a terrifying second, she didn't know where she was. Then she felt the hard earth against her cheek and remembered. The loneliness was so big, it felt like it was crushing her. She clutched Anya so tight, the doll's little cloth seemed strained. She didn't whisper to the mound that night. She just lay there, small and shivering, a tiny spot of life against the great, dark silence of the land, waiting for a dawn that felt like it would never come. Her vigil was no longer just about waiting for her mother to wake up. It had become the only thing she knew how to do. It was her whole world now, this patch of dirt and this quilt and the terrible, quiet understanding that was slowly taking root in her heart. While the little girl kept her lonely watch on the hill, another pair of eyes saw the story of the land. A man moved through the prairie a mile or so to the west, along the tree line that marked the course of a slow, muddy creek. He traveled quiet, a man who had learned that silence was both a way to listen and a way to move unseen. He was a trapper, of mixed heritage, a man who belonged to the open spaces between settlements. His name was not important to many people, and he liked it that way. He knew this territory, its hidden paths, and its small, struggling claims. He had seen the man of this particular homestead ride out days ago, his face set in that grim way men have when they are riding toward hope, but fear they are already too late. The trapper had noted it, just as he noted the flight of birds or the direction of the wind. It was a piece of information about the world. 2 mornings after the man left, the trapper was checking his lines along the creek when he saw a change on the hill. A patch of fresh, dark earth where there had been none before. He stopped, his movement still. He understood that dark patch. It was a language everyone on the prairie could read. A grave. He scanned the cabin below. No smoke from the chimney. No movement. Just a deep, waiting silence. He felt a tug inside, a feeling he usually ignored. His own life was one of solitude and slow movement. Getting involved in the troubles of others was a complication, and the prairie taught you that complications could cost you. He turned back to his work, but the image of that lonely grave on the hill stayed with him. It was the only one. Just a single mound. Where was the family? Had everyone left? Something felt unfinished. The next day, his path took him a little closer. He found a spot within sight of the homestead, a place where the trees and brush gave him cover. He sat down, his back against a rough trunk, and simply watched. This was something he was good at. Watching Dot in the afternoon, he saw her. A small figure, like a little ghost, coming down from the hill toward the cabin. A child. She moved slowly, with the heavy steps of someone who is very tired. She went inside the cabin for a short time, then came back out and walked, with a purpose that broke his heart, right back up the hill to that dark patch of earth. She had something in her arms. A blanket. She spread it out and lay down. The trapper's breath caught in his throat. He understood now. The single grave. The missing man. The child keeping watch. He had seen death many times, in the wild and among people. But this faithful, desperate vigil was a different kind of ache. He didn't move. He watched as the afternoon light faded. He saw her small form curled on the quilt, a tiny speck of color against the vast brown and green of the prairie. He saw her sit up sometimes, her head turning as if she were talking to someone. A deep frown settled on his weathered face. This was not his business. And yet it was. The code of the land was harsh, but it was not without heart. No creature, man or beast, should be left so utterly alone. On the second day of his watch, he saw the change in her. She didn't walk down to the cabin. She hardly moved from the quilt. Her movements, when she did shift, were listless, like a little puppet whose strings were cut. He knew what that meant. Thirst. Hunger. The cold nights were stealing her strength. A fever of exhaustion would be next. She was a candle flame guttering in the wind, and soon, very soon, it would go out. That evening, back at his own small, hidden camp by the creek, the decision settled in him. It was as quiet and firm as the setting of the sun. He could not just ride on. He had been made a witness, and to witness and then do nothing was a weight his spirit would not carry. He began to prepare, but not with haste. Haste startled people and animals, and this child was both. He built his small fire and boiled water, adding bits of dried meat and wild onion to make a thin broth. He poured it into his small sealed tin cup, wrapping it in a piece of sackcloth to keep it warm. He checked his pack horse, a big, calm creature with a broad back and gentle eyes. The horse was used to carrying strange loads, pelts, traps, supplies. It would need to carry something more precious now. The trapper spoke softly to the horse as he worked, his hands smoothing the animal's coat. "Easy, Gideon. Easy now. We have a small, sad bird to fetch. You must be like stone and like feathers, all at once." The horse blew out a soft breath, as if it understood. He looked toward the hill, now just a dark shape against a starry sky. The child would be up there, shivering under her quilt, waiting for a morning that brought no change. He knew he would go at first light. The dark could be too frightening for a child already swimming in fear. He needed her to see him, to see that he was not a spirit or a monster, but just a man. He sat by his fire, not sleeping much, listening to the night. His thoughts were not many, but they were clear. He thought of his own losses, long ago, buried in a different ground. He thought of the terrible silence of an empty cabin. He was a man who had chosen a lonely road, but he knew this child had not chosen hers. She had been left on it by a cruel turn of fate. When the first gray light began to bleed into the eastern sky, he stood. He poured warm broth from a pot into his canteen. He saddled Gideon, not with the usual packs, but leaving the back clear. He mounted up, a canteen and a soft wool trade blanket tied securely. He turned the horse's head toward the homestead and began to ride, not fast, but with a steady, deliberate pace. The quiet horseman was no longer just watching. He was going to the little girl on the hill. The man on the horse, Gideon, moved across the prairie as the sun pulled itself over the edge of the world. It was a cold, clean light that showed every blade of grass and the deep silence of the land. The trapper's eyes were fixed on the hill. He saw the small, lumpy shape on the quilt, not moving. He guided Gideon not straight to the hill, but toward the cabin first. He wanted to come into view slowly, to not seem like he was swooping down from the sky. The horse's hooves made a soft, thudding sound on the hard earth. The sound seemed enormous in the quiet morning dot up on the hill. Elara heard it. It was a different sound from the wind or the birds. It was a steady, rhythmic beat. Thump, thump, thump. She was in that place between sleep and waking, where nothing feels real. Her body ached with a deep, dull pain. Her mouth was dry as dust. She thought maybe she was dreaming the sound. She slowly turned her head, her cheeks scraping against the rough quilt. She saw them then. A man and a horse, down by the empty cabin. They were standing still, as if they were part of a picture. She felt no fear. She was too tired for fear. She just watched, her eyes blurry. The man seemed to look right at her for a long moment. Then he turned the horse and began to walk it, slowly, so slowly, up the gentle slope toward her. Her heart beat a little faster then, a tiny drum in her weak chest. But she didn't sit up. She didn't have the strength. She just watched him come. He was a big man, wrapped in a worn leather coat, his face shadowed by a wide-brimmed hat. But he didn't feel scary. He moved with a quiet care, like someone walking through a room where people were sleeping. Gideon, the big horse, stopped a few feet away from the edge of the quilt. The man looked down at her. His face was weathered, lined by sun and wind, but his eyes, when she finally saw them, were a soft, dark brown. They held no smile, but they held no threat either. They just looked, and in that look was a deep, sad understanding. He didn't say, "Hello, little girl." He didn't ask what she was doing there. He simply slid down from the saddle, his movements smooth and quiet. He knelt on the ground, not on her quilt, but on the grass beside it. He was so close she could smell the campfire smoke and the scent of leather and horse on him. For a long minute, he said nothing. He just looked from her small, dirty face to the fresh mound of earth and back again. His own face worked for a moment, a flicker of pain crossing it, as if her sadness was a weight he could feel. Then he moved. He unslung the canteen from his shoulder. He opened it carefully, the sound of the metal cap loud in the stillness. He didn't hand it to her. Instead, he held it out, supporting the bottom with his other hand, and brought it close to her lips. "Here," he said. His voice was low and rough, like stones rubbing together, but it was gentle. Slowly now. A tiny spark of instinct made Elara part her dry, cracked lips. The cool metal rim touched them. He tipped the canteen just a little. Water, wonderful and wet, flowed into her mouth. It wasn't just water. It had a faint, warm taste of meat and salt. It was broth. The warmth of it spread through her, a feeling so good it almost hurt. She took a few small swallows and turned her head away, her body trembling. He put the cap back on the canteen and set it down. Then he stood up and went to his horse. From a bundle, he pulled out a blanket. It was thick and gray, made of heavy wool. He came back and, without a word, draped it over her. He tucked the edges around her small form, over her own quilt. The weight of it was immense and comforting. It was like being held. He knelt again. This time he spoke, looking not at her, but at the grave. "You kept a good watch," he said softly, as if speaking to the mother in the ground. "A brave watch." Then he looked at Elara. "But the watch is done now. It's time to come away from the cold ground." He didn't grab her. He didn't even reach for her right away. He simply opened his arms, a question in the gesture. His big, rough hands were open and empty. Elara looked from his face to the mound. A terrible confusion tore at her. Leaving felt like a betrayal. It felt like saying goodbye forever. A small, broken sound escaped her lips, a whimper of pure loss. Her eyes filled with tears that spilled over, making clean tracks through the dirt on her cheeks. The man understood. He nodded slowly. "She's not in this dirt," he said, his voice still that low, steady rumble. He pointed a finger, not at the grave, but at Alara's own chest, right over her heart. "She's in there now. She rides with you. You carry her, and she would not want you to be cold." The words were strange, but they seeped into her tired mind. Asterisk, you carry her. She rides with you. Asterisk, she looked down at her own small body, wrapped in the big blanket. She thought of her mother's voice, her smell, her smile. Maybe that was where she lived now, not just in the hill. With an effort that took all her little strength, she gave a tiny, almost invisible nod. That was all the man needed. He moved then, with a breathtaking tenderness. He slid one arm under her knees and the other behind her back. He was careful to keep the wool blanket wrapped tightly around her. He lifted her as if she were made of glass and the most precious thing in the world. She was so light in his arms, a bundle of quilt and wool and aching bones. He carried her the few steps to Gideon, who stood patiently. "Steady, brother," the man whispered to the horse. He did not throw her up into the saddle. Instead, he placed her gently, carefully onto the front of it, sitting her sideways so she could lean. He arranged the blankets around her, making sure she was secure. Then he put her small, ragged doll into the cocoon of blankets with her. He put his foot in the stirrup and swung up behind her, settling into the saddle. His body was a solid wall at her back. One of his arms came around her, holding her firmly and safely against him. He took the reins with his other hand. He did not immediately ride away. He let Gideon stand for a moment. He let the child feel the solidity of the horse, the safety of being held. He let her look one last time at the hill, at the quilt left behind on the grass, at the small cabin that was no longer a home. Then, with the slightest pressure of his knees, he guided Gideon to turn. They began to move, walking slowly, away from the hill, down the slope, and onto the wide, open path of the prairie, heading east toward the rising sun and the unknown world of people and help. The little girl, held fast in the quiet strength of the horseman, finally closed her eyes, not to keep a vigil, but to rest. The horse walked with a gentle, rolling motion. For Alara, wrapped in the thick blanket and held firmly against the man's solid chest, it felt like being rocked. The terrible cold that had sunk into her bones began to loosen its grip, replaced by the warmth from the broth and from the man's steady body. She didn't sleep, but she floated in a quiet daze, her eyes half open, watching the endless grass slowly pass by. The man did not try to talk to her. He just let the rhythm of the journey speak for him. Sometimes he would check the blanket around her, tucking in a loose corner. Once he offered the canteen again, and she took another small sip. The kindness was in his actions, not in any words. It was a quiet that felt safe, not empty. After a long while, the land began to change. The endless flatness gave way to small dips and rises. They crossed a shallow, chattering creek where Gideon stopped to drink. The man led him, his arm holding Alara a little tighter as the horse bent its head. She saw a hawk circling high above, riding the wind, and for the first time in days, she saw something besides, the walls of the cabin and the earth of the hill. The sun was high in the sky when she saw the first sign of other people. It was a thin, dark line on the horizon that wasn't trees. Smoke. Then, as they crested a low ridge, the line became shapes, buildings, a cluster of maybe a dozen houses, a bigger barn, and a building with a tall, thin spire. A settlement. A nervous flutter stirred in Alara's stomach. The world had become so small for so long, just her and the hill. Now it was opening up again, big and strange. She pressed back a little harder against the man. He seemed to feel her tension. He looked down at the top of her head. "Almost there," he murmured, his voice a low vibration against her back. "Good people." He did not ride into the middle of town. He guided Gideon around to the edge, toward a small, tidy house with a fence and a vegetable garden gone brown with the season. A woman was outside, hanging wet clothes on a line. She was older, with a kind, round face and sleeves rolled up to her elbows. She heard the horse and turned, her hands pausing on a wet shirt. Her eyes went wide as she took in the sight, the rough-looking trapper on his big horse, and the small, blanket-wrapped bundle in his arms. She dropped the shirt back into her basket and came to the fence, wiping her hands on her apron. "Good heavens," she said, her voice full of soft surprise. The man brought Gideon to a stop. He looked down at the woman. "Found her on the Larson claim," he said, his words short and plain. "By the new grave on the hill. 3 days, maybe. The man's gone. No one else." The woman's hand flew to her mouth. Her eyes instantly filled with tears. She looked at Alara's small, pale face, peeking out from the blankets. "Oh, you poor lamb," she whispered, the words full of a warmth that felt like a hearth fire. "You poor, brave lamb?" The trapper swung down from the saddle. He lifted Alara down with the same great care, holding her in his arms as he walked to the gate. The woman unlatched it and hurried forward, her arms outstretched not to take the child, but to usher them inside. "Bring her in, bring her right in. Leave that horse be, he's fine there." Inside, the house was warm and smelled of soap and baking bread. It was a gentle shock to Alara's senses. The woman cleared a cushioned chair by the stove, and the man set Alara down in it, making sure the blanket was still snug. The woman bustled, bringing a cup of warm milk with a little honey mixed in. She didn't ask questions Alara would have to answer. She just spoke in a soft, steady stream. "There now, just a little sip. Let's get those cold shoes off. My, what a strong girl you must be." The trapper stood near the door, his hat in his hands, looking out of place among the lace curtains and braided rugs. He watched as the woman's gentle efficiency began to pull the child back from the edge. The hollow look in Alara's eyes started to soften, just a little, under the woman's kindness. After a few minutes, the woman looked at the trapper. "You'll be wanting to get on your way, I expect. We'll care for her here. The preacher and I will see to everything." The man nodded. But before he turned to go, he knelt down in front of Alara's chair. He reached into a deep pocket of his coat and pulled something out. It was a small horse, carved from a piece of smooth, dark wood. It was simple, but you could see the shape of its head and the curve of its back. It fit perfectly in the palm of his big hand. He held it out to her. "To remember the ride," he said quietly. Alara looked from the wooden horse to his face. Slowly, her small hand came out from under the blanket. She took the carving. It felt solid and real. She didn't say thank you. She couldn't find any words. But she held it tightly, her fingers curling around it. The man stood up. He gave one last, long look at the little girl in the chair, now safe, now sheltered. He nodded to the woman, put his hat back on his head, and walked out the door, closing it softly behind him. From the window, the woman watched him go. He mounted Gideon, turned the horse, and without a look back, rode toward the western edge of town, back the way he had come. He disappeared into the landscape as quietly as he had entered it. The news spread through the small settlement like a ripple on a pond. Men organized a party to ride out to the Larson claim. They found the grave, the quilt, the cold cabin. Later, they would hear news from another town down the line about a man who had tried to cross the swollen river and never made it. The story of the little girl on the hill and the quiet horseman became a legend told in whispers, a story of terrible sadness and a small, quiet mercy. For Elara, life began again slowly. She stayed with the preacher and his wife, who were as kind as the first morning she met them. The deep crack in her heart would never fully heal, but it slowly scarred over. She kept the wooden horse. It sat on the windowsill by her new bed. Sometimes, on clear days, she would look out at the western prairie, the endless grass waving in the wind. She would hold the smooth carving in her hand and think not of the cold hill, but of the steady rhythm of a horse's walk, the solid safety of an arm around her, and the low voice that had told her, "You carry her. She rides with you." The man had given her more than a ride to safety. He had given her a way to understand that love isn't always a place you can stay. Sometimes it's something you carry with you, a warmth you take on the long road ahead. And sometimes, for a little while, it comes in the form of a quiet horseman who lifts you up and carries you home.